Having been around the photographic world for a couple of decades now, I've seen a good few trends come and go. And one of them that currently tickles me quite a bit is this idea of images being cinematic. Now it tickles me because making our images look more dramatic and filmic and cinematic is something I'm actually hugely in favour of. I'll explain a bit more about that later. But what so much of this current trend seems to be about is tutorial videos on how to add flare, which lens gives the best depth of field, and how to colour grade your images for that cinematic look, or even just how to drop in a letterbox to make it look like it was shot anamorphically. This video isn't going to be one of those tutorial videos. Sorry. All of those techniques, like any and every technique, have their place. Combine some or all of them and your images might look a bit more cinematic. I'm going to stop doing air quotes now because I'm going to say cinematic so often. You get the idea, it's a label. However, there's also a decent chance that what will happen is you'll take a very average shot and just make it look a bit different. Now, before I come across as just being cynical and damning any form of post-production, I ought to state that for me, a cinematic image is something that I almost always strive for. The problem with all these techniques is that they miss the central point for me of cinematic, and they try and reduce it down to an Instagram filter or a certain lens. Let me try and explain what I mean by cinematic by turning the clock back about 20 years or so to when I was a young assistant photographer working in London. At the start of the millennium, one of the people I assisted did me an enormous favour. One that I strongly suspect he didn't think would still have an effect nearly 20 years later. At the time, as a freelancer, I was assisting several different photographers, wide variety of backgrounds, all sorts of work. There were fashion photographers who shot 10 by 8 inch Polaroids, still life photographers, celebrity photographers who turned up with their own emotional baggage and massive hangovers to boot. And then there was Graham, who wasn't strictly speaking a photographer. Graham Fink is this fella's name. You can go and look him up. He's still around now. He's still a very successful creative director, as he was back then, with a string of commercials, music videos and awards to his name. Obviously, he's a great creative, but he's not somebody who gets too involved in the technical side of things, so my role as an assistant was to handle lots of the technical bits when we were shooting. After we'd done a few jobs together, I asked him a huge favour. Would he mind casting his professional, creative eye over my current portfolio? He agreed, and I duly trooped into a swanky ad agency office in Soho in the centre of London. Now, bearing in mind, this was the days of film, so what I had was a series of mounted prints. As an assistant, of course, I had very, very little money to spare, so these were all done on a shoestring budget. But even so, I accepted that and I wanted his honest opinion. I laid all my prints out on the table. Graham walked around the table once, and after looking at everything, he asked me, "Well, what do you want me to do?" To which I replied, "I'd like your opinion." "Really? Are you sure?" "Yes." "Okay, but you won't like it." He then proceeded to pick holes in nearly everything I'd shot, which of course, for any of us, is quite hard to take. Now, some of his critique could be argued away in the sense that, of course, I didn't have a lot of money, I couldn't shoot big high-end productions, I couldn't afford fancy retouching, so you could argue, well, okay, that's not fair to pick on me in that regard. However, there was one critique which was absolute gold, and it's the one that's relevant to this whole idea of cinematic that I keep talking about. Now, at the time, as I do to this day, I shot a lot of portraits. In those days, I was often shooting sort of half-length, quite straight onto camera, fairly flat lit, stuff like this. These are in fact prints from that critique. Graham took one of these and said, "This is television. You should be shooting film." I'll admit, I had absolutely no idea what he meant at this point, and I asked him to explain, and this is the real nugget. What he said was, TV is banal, boring and everyday. Film is emotional, engaging and dramatic. As a photographer, You should be trying to shoot the latter, not the former. Now, if all of that sounds a bit abstract, it's actually very easy to see what he means. Just go and turn your TV on and flick between channels. Watch how the visual approach changes from something like a soap opera or chat show to a feature film or a drama. TV will be flat, banal, and made to look as everyday and normal as possible, with shots that often show the whole room in focus from front to back, and lighting that's flattering but ultimately flat. Film will employ close-ups, wide shots, they'll be lit to create mood, there might be jarring cuts or edits. Film exists to excite the emotions, elicit a response, and transport you away from the everyday. TV aims to distract you from the everyday by showing you a slightly enhanced version of what's already happening. Now, bear in mind, he gave me this advice back in 2000, before the days of TV dramas being shot on feature film budgets. Things like Breaking Bad, The Wire, Band of Brothers even going back nearly 20 years, Game of Thrones, we could very easily lump into the film box rather than TV, even though they are ostensibly TV. A better label than film would perhaps be drama. An even better label would perhaps be cinematic. Now, I realise that I'm making quite big, sweeping generalisations here, but I think his central point is very valid indeed. As photographers, our aim should be to excite, intrigue, and add drama to things, rather than just simply try and mimic daily life and reproduce the banal. Now, I also appreciate that that particular approach won't ring true for everyone, and that some artists like Andreas Gursky, Martin Parr, have created amazing work by celebrating the banal. I could easily at this point get into quite a heated debate about the role of the banal and the everyday in art, but that wouldn't really help anyone watching this go out and take better, more interesting images, so let's avoid that for now. But what would help people go out and take better, more interesting images, even perhaps cinematic images? Well, if we define cinematic as being dramatic, narrative-driven, visually interesting and emotionally involved, then those are the areas we need to think about when we're planning our shots. I appreciate this isn't quite as simple as just downloading a LUT pack. Above all, start with a good idea of what it is you're really trying to shoot. This is without doubt the most useful and beneficial photographic tip I can ever pass on. You need to move beyond just, I want to take a photograph of this person, place or thing, and ask yourself why. What is it about that person, place or thing that interests you, and then work to get that across in the image. If you've got some more emotional investment in the image, try and get that across. And if you haven't, ask yourself why you're even bothering to take your camera out if you're not emotionally invested in what you're shooting. If you're taking a picture of a person, then work as hard as you can to get what you want from their performance in front of the camera. If it's a landscape, think and plan carefully about the right angle, the right time of day, even the right weather, to maximise your chances of getting a shot that says what you want about this particular landscape. And so on, no matter what the subject. When you're framing your shot, exclude everything from the frame that doesn't contribute to what you want to say about the subject, and include as much as is required to say it. Scan the edges of the frame ruthlessly for anything that shouldn't be there, and reframe, move or reposition yourself or the things you're shooting until it looks just right. There's also no harm in allowing yourself the option of retouching out things that you can't avoid, like power lines, phone sockets, that sort of thing. But I'd strongly suggest that you make every effort you can to get things right in camera. Once you've got those fundamentals in place and you know what you're photographing, then you can bring into play all the other visual aspects that take your image from a simple, banal record shot to something much more cinematic. You can think about the lighting and how best to exploit or control it to get your story across. You'll need to choose the right lens along with lots of other aspects of kit, and you might need to practice or hone a certain technique if you're trying something new. You can also, of course, employ any of the techniques mentioned at the top of this video, and take into account the vast, vast landscape of post-production or retouching techniques that you could then do to the image to get that story across that interested you in the first place. All of these elements are part of the recipe, but they're not the meal itself. What matters in terms of making your images more cinematic is getting that initial idea and story right and communicating it. If you've no idea what it is and you just go out and shoot, then slap on some grading, flare, letterboxing, you might get lucky. But you'll definitely improve your odds if you have a good think through ahead of time. So sorry, no quick answer to make your images more cinematic, as is so often the case. Mind you, I think if you spend even a few minutes before each shoot thinking about what it is you really want to capture and get across, you will soon start to see much more interesting results than if you just start slapping lots of stuff on in post-production. So try and remember what Graham told me 20 odd years ago. Cinematic isn't about grading, filters, lens flare or lens choice or even letterboxing. A cinematic image is one that's full of drama and emotional involvement. Concentrate on that and your images will be much more interesting than if you just muck about in post.